Enemy eliminated.
The 4X genre, where you make cities which make armies which fight other cities until the cities become your cities and everything's usually hexagonal, isn't one that I'm hugely acquainted with. I've played Civilization 5 a bunch and Endless Legend a bit, but that's about it. Age of Wonders Planetfall intrigued me nonetheless, with its talk of laser dinosaurs during the PC gaming show at E3 earlier this year, and so now I've played it a bit too. As such, don't watch this video review expecting an in-depth analysis of Planetfall's place within the ocean of 4X games from an expert on all those like it. See it more as an assessment of whether it serves as a good jumping in point for a relative newcomer, not just to the Age of Wonders series, but to the style of game as a whole. Here are 5 ways Age of Wonders Planetfall is and isn't good for beginners. Just before we begin though, thanks to Logitech G and the G432 7.1 surround sound gaming headset for sponsoring this video. To check out the tech behind the G432, click the link in the description. When you get right down to it, Age of Wonders Planetfall's ins and outs are pretty easy to comprehend. It's somewhat standard for the 4X genre, with a pool of different resources that each hex on the map provides differing quantities of when they're under your control. Here you build colonies, and from them you can train different units for your armies, construct new buildings, and generate more resources. In Planetfall, once you've annexed a hex into one of your colonies, you can initiate an exploitation. This, in effect, siphons resources from that hex and adds them to your colony's resource pool. For instance, this hex that I've annexed here is rich with the production resource, so I can set my colony to construct a production exploitation on the annexed hex, giving me more production with which to build new things. Something that makes it a bit different is that you can create your own hero, the person in charge of your society on whatever planet you find yourself on. For a 4X game, the character creator is relatively robust. Here's my little lad, a Dvar, who are basically space dwarves, with a funky hat and some tubes for a beard, called Boris Babushka. When you put a hero together, you can choose their background and also their technological specialisation, which gives you different things to spec into in your skill trees in-game, depending on what you go for. My background is as a spy, so researching anything to do with covert operations becomes cheaper for me. And my tech is Promethean, which will eventually let me build weapons of mass destruction and just set everything on fire until it's proper dead. It's a fun way of making the genre staple of the tech tree feel more like a skill tree from an RPG. Thing is, it took me a few hours to realise that what I was playing was relatively straightforward and easy to get to grips with, having only played a couple of 4X games previously. Why? Well, there's the expected learning curve of figuring out what the different resources do and what actions do different things. That's fine, but the tutorial messages that were violently thrust at me when I started the first campaign, they were less some easy tips and pointers on how to play the game properly and more closely resembled a form of psychological torture. You barely get a single click in, and then the frustrating AI helper will go on, and 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 on. Stop! Fucking stop! I had more luck figuring out how to play Planetfall on my own, playing a custom scenario instead of a campaign mission and just fiddling with everything without any help than I did suffering through all those messages. It's a sensory overload, giving you far too much information in a single go that it expects you to process far too quickly. Perhaps this is because I'm really autistic, but fellow RPS treehouser Nate Crowley, who I played some of the online multiplayer with, does share my opinion. Planetfall is a bit of a departure from the typical high fantasy of the Age of Wonders series. Triumph Studios seems to have hit the ground running with the sci-fi setting though. The whole premise is that 200 years ago, a civilization called the Star Union has spread throughout the galaxy thanks to FTL travel, but the Void, which was used to achieve this, breaks a bit, fragmenting the different groups that made up the Union on varying different planets in all sorts of star systems. During those 2 centuries, each faction developed themselves in different ways to adapt to their environments. In the present day, FTL is back again, and now the 6 races are at each other's throats to try and cement their own places in the galaxy. The factions are really interesting too. There's the Amazons, genetic engineers turned fierce woman warriors who ride dinosaurs with lasers on them into battle. The Dvar, Russian space dwarves with big tanks, big bellies and big explosives. The Kir'Ko, swarming bugs once enslaved by the Star Union and now out for revenge by attacking their foes with battle vomit, and a few more. Nate's playing the Kir'Ko at the moment, and his hero, Christopher Johnson, has a cool cape and some sunglasses, the absolute mad lad. This world building extends beyond Planetfall's playable races too. There's an NPC faction called the Spacers, who Nate and I stumbled across in our multiplayer game. They've got this whole Mad Max vibe going on, with cobbled together vehicles covered in spikes. What makes them really interesting though is how they came to be. The Spacers used to be everyday folks living in the Star Union, perpetually hooked up to a Ready Player One style virtual world. When FTL travel stopped functioning and the Star Union crumbled apart, this virtual reality got switched off. They were abandoned and forced into a barbaric existence, fueling their raging warfare with a cocktail of combat drugs. That's really cool and quite original, and this background is reflected in the visual design. You'll see some Spacers with VR headsets strapped to their faces. The visual design in general is pretty stunning, thanks to an overall artistic direction that nails the space opera look, and a lot of care given to the tiny details. The fact that Planetfall is a teensy bit like a bargain bucket Warhammer 40,000, with factions that are not Imperium, not Tyranids, not Chaos, and not Space Dwarves if you're old school, plus a dangerous hyperspace thing that's definitely not the Warp, could be forgiven thanks to all of the interesting little idiosyncrasies that it has besides. I say could be because fuck me if the way it communicates all of this lore to you isn't the most boring, generic way it possibly could have done. The first campaign, in which you assume the role of Vanguard Commander Jack Gelder, a big bland man with a big fancy coat and an edgy white hair streak and facial scar, is a little bit cringy. The voice acting isn't fantastic, the writing of the dialogue feels forced with tropey sci-fi quips and mil-tech chit-chat that leaves a lot to be desired, and the music is bog-standard brassy boredom. So all of that interesting background lore largely confines to the little snippets of flavour text attached to the various units of each race. That's all you really get outside of the campaign anyway, which there's every chance you'll stop playing if you bounced off it like I did. It feels like a quick 30 to 60 second storyboarded concept art cutscene for each race and NPC faction that tells you a little bit about what their whole jam is when you first encounter them in game, could go a long way towards remedying it all. Without it, I was forced to roll my eyes and skip the trash to get to reading all that flavour text as quickly as possible in a desperate dash to get myself hooked in on the world, which I did eventually. It just took a lot of effort. Like other Age of Wonders games before it, Planetfall allows you one of two means of going about combat. Either it's resolved automatically, taking into account the power of your forces against the enemies and deciding the outcome through behind the scenes dice rolling, or you can enter manual tactical combat. The only 4X games I've played before are Civilization V and Endless Legends, so I've not had a go at those that allow you this option. I am, however, a huge fan of tactical turn-based combat like in XCOM and especially the harebrained schemes Shadowrun games, and it feels really cool for fighting to be done in this way in this genre. It's also probably one of the more approachable elements of the game for newcomers. Tactical turn-based combat usually is. You have different units with different roles and specialisations. I have some trenchers who can construct fortifications around them which act as cover, for example, and figuring out how to best use what you have comes pretty naturally. Seeing how each race operates as differently in combat as they do in other aspects of the game really goes a long way towards fleshing them out as distinct from each other, and reinforces their fluff too. Nate's Kir'Ko, for example, are a swarming insect race, so their units naturally gain a protective buff whenever they're close to each other. I think this style of combat is also a part of what made it really easy to get as immersed in Planetfall as I did once things got going. In other 4X games, everything can feel very distant. You're just moving pieces around a big map and clicking on things in menus, so it's quite challenging to get into the mindset of actually being an explorer in an exotic world. Combat dragging you from this macro scale down to the micro scale of a battlefield reminds you that the troops you push across the map are individual soldiers. It makes you care about them, and so you end up feeling like you're the commander on the field with them, instead of just an omnipresent observer. Two players can both enter combat at the same time as allies too, which allows for some jazzy tactical flanking, and means you feel that same immersive connection to the other factions in the game. So what's the verdict? How does Age of Wonders Planetfall fare for a newbie? Pretty well, I reckon. I had some doubts to begin with, but once I really got into it, it ended up clicking for me. It even took me less time to get to grips with than Civ 5, which might have a little bit to do with me having played it before, but there's a lot about Planetfall specifically which helped me with that too. I really do think the tactical combat goes a long way towards making it feel approachable, and knowing that it features in other Age of Wonders games has now actually encouraged me to try out previous entries in the series. If you love tactical combat and have always been a little bit curious about 4X, definitely give Planetfall a go. If you come to this from something like XCOM, the Vanguard being one of the 2 races in the game with the ability to put units into Overwatch will definitely feel familiar for you, so give them a go for your first couple of games. My recommendation generally would be that if you're new to this sort of thing, hop into a multiplayer game with a friend and figure things out for yourselves together. Playing it a bunch with Nate was a lot more enjoyable than it was on my lonesome, and a lot less daunting as well. You'll miss out on the story from the campaign, but as has already been said, you won't be missing much and will have a far better time learning more about the world through the unit flavour text. Planetfall really surprised me, and if you find these sorts of games a bit difficult to mesh with like I do, give this one a go to see if it helps. You might end up having a great time. Thanks again to Logitech G for sponsoring this video, featuring 50mm audio drivers, a 6mm mic and DTS Headphone X 2.0 surround sound technology under the hood. The G432 headset immerses you in the action and ensures you'll always be heard for a complete gaming experience. Find out how to order yours by following the link in the description. If you have any questions about Age of Wonders Planetfall, do pop them in the comments, I'd be happy to answer them. And if you haven't already, you could like this video if you found it useful and subscribe to Rock Paper Shotgun if you fancy seeing more stuff like this. Thanks for watching, and hopefully see you again soon.